Welcome. We're happy to have you here with us today for the first webinar in our Enhancing Virtual Early Childhood Services with AEPS. I'm Amy Klaus, Marketing Manager for Early Childhood Products at Brooks Publishing, and I'm very happy to have Dr. Jennifer Grisham joining us today to talk about authentic virtual assessment. Before we start, I just have a few tips for listening to the webinar. So we recommend that you close any applications that may take up bandwidth just for a better viewing experience. And if you have any audio problems, make sure your audio is set to computer speakers and turn your speakers all the way up, and then you can always try reconnecting to the webinar. We're going to be taking questions at the end of the presentation, so please type them into your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll take those at the end. And we're also going to have a survey at the end of the webinar. So we really love feedback, so we encourage you to fill it out, and we'll be selecting one person who completes it to win a free book of their choice. So Jennifer, if you don't mind moving the slides for me, just there's our survey, and then to the next one, just to let everyone know, we are going to be giving a certificate of attendance for today's webinar. For everyone joining us live right now, you'll receive a certificate in a follow-up email tomorrow afternoon. And there's also a blank certificate that's in the webinar panel, the handout section, so you can go ahead and download that right now if you want. We are recording this session, and for attendees who are listening to the recording, a URL to receive your certificate is going to be provided at the end of the presentation. So also, the slide handouts for today's presentation are uploaded in the handout section as well. And there's a URL that I put in the chat box, so if you'd rather download them right now. And they'll be in tomorrow's follow-up email as well. So before we get started, we wanted to just ask a couple questions of our audience. So I'm going to launch a poll asking about how your program is currently delivering services right now. Are you delivering services in person, virtual, or hybrid? So we'll give you a couple seconds to respond. It looks like a lot of people are virtual so far. So just give a couple more seconds. Thank you for responding. All right. I'm going to share. So it looks like over 80% of people are providing virtual services right now, and only 3% are doing in-person services. So that's helpful for us to know as we're presenting the webinar today. So our second poll question, we're interested to know, how is your program using AEPS this fall? So you can check all of the ways that you're using AEPS. All right, so I'm seeing some responses come in. Thank you for voting. We'll just wait a couple more seconds to give more people some time to respond. A lot of people marking progress monitoring. That seems to be the most common. Also eligibility. All right, I'll wait just about 10 more seconds. And goal planning, a lot of people now. Great. Thank you. I will share the results here. So looks like the highest 79% of programs are using it for progress monitoring, 60% are using it for goal planning, around the same 45 for intervention and 44 for eligibility, and then 30% of programs listening today are using it for accountability and OSEP reporting. So thank you very much for responding. That really helps us know who's listening today. So now I'm happy to introduce Jennifer Grisham. Dr. Grisham is an author for the new edition of AEPS that's coming in the next year or so, and an expert trainer on the AEPS tool. She's a professor in interdisciplinary early childhood education program at the University of Kentucky, and also the director of the Early Childhood Laboratory at the university, which is an inclusive early childhood program for children from birth to 5 years. So welcome, Jennifer. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Amy. It's very nice to be here. When earlier in the summer or late spring, Brooks came to us and asked us to do a coffee chat, and Christy Preddy-Franzak and I proposed to do something around virtual assessment. And I believe that both of us felt like that when we did that, we had no idea that, 6 months later, we would still be discussing the same topic, and that it would still be as important as it was in March or April. So thank you all for coming. I know it is a very stressful time for anyone that's in early intervention or working in early education. My office is located inside of an early childhood center. We are a licensed child care program and inclusive program, and so we have been back at reduced capacity since the middle of June, but we're all presented with a lot of challenges. And for 3 months, the teachers at our center were dealing with some of the virtual challenges that you all were with, and some of the information that I'm going to share today actually came from their real experiences having to complete their end year AEPS on all of the children in their classroom before the end of the actual school year. So welcome, and thank you for having me. So what I want to do today is to give you a very brief refresher about what authentic assessment is, reminding everybody that authentic assessment is one of the recommended assessment practices for young children with and without disabilities, and how the AEPS fits the profile as being an authentic assessment. We're going to talk about how the AEPS can be used in virtual settings across all of the different reasons or purposes that we do assessment, program planning, progress monitoring, etc. We're going to review some strategies for collecting authentic assessment information, and because there's a variety of users out there, some of you all are using the AEPSI or the online version. Some of you all are still using the paper version. Brooks has done a wonderful job about trying to accommodate the needs of all people, but we are very fortunate to have Monica Bell, who oversees the AEPSI work. And so if you have specific questions related to any of the forms or any of the processes that I talk about, we can direct those at Monica, and she's with us today that she can answer those questions. We're going to talk about, again, strategies for collecting data, and also we're going to talk about the fillable assessment activities. Through each of these webinars we've designed, you all will be getting a free resource from Brooks to help you in this challenge of trying to collect assessment and deliver intervention virtually. So what is the AEPS? Many of you all are using the AEPS. It is Assessment, Evaluation, and Programming System, which means that it is an assessment that is linked together for a variety of purposes to gather information about young children and to evaluate their progress, and also to deliver an embedded instructional program to them within a system. It is a criterion reference curriculum-based assessment, meaning that the primary reason for which the tool was developed was for comparing children against themselves. So not unlike a norm referenced assessment, which compares children against another set of children, the AEPS looks at children's progress over time and compares their performance on items on the test to a standard or a criterion that tells us whether or not the child has mastered the item, whether it's an item that is emerging, or whether the child is not ready for the item yet. It has been used, it was originally designed for children with disabilities, but it's used regularly throughout the country for children with and without disabilities who are birth to 5 years of age. It's part of a linked system, and you see the diagram over here in the bottom right. And we talk a lot within the AEPS system about it being a linked system, meaning that every component of the AEPS is dependent on the next component. So we have to gather good assessment information about young children in order to develop functional and generalizable goals that can be meaningfully embedded into children's activities and routines in home and community-based classroom-based settings. And also then we want to evaluate the children's performance on those goals to determine whether or not the child is making progress or whether or not the intervention that we are delivering is making sense and working for that child. And so that's the evaluation piece of it. And so if one of those pieces or parts is not working correctly, then the whole system kind of falls apart, if you will. And so we oftentimes think so much about the AEPS being a test, but it's also something that can help people implement recommended practices for children with and without disabilities in a variety of settings. I use the word validated for use for. Much of my time and work in the last 2 or 3 years with the AEPS 3 has been on validating the new test. And so I'm very entrenched in the research that's been done on the AEPS. And so when I say it's been validated for, I mean that research has been conducted with the AEPS to show that it can be used effectively for program planning to help to determine meaningful, generalizable, functional, family-centered goals for children, that it can be used as a progress monitoring tool to show that children can make progress, how children make progress over time. It's also been validated, although not originally, it's been validated for eligibility purposes. And I know that I have some of my Kentucky friends and colleagues that are on this call, and I know that with some of the new wording that OSEP or new direction that OSEP is giving regarding how to determine eligibility in Part C, that tools like the AEPS can now be considered for use for eligibility purposes. It's been used in some states for many years for that purpose, but now given the situation with the difficulty of administering a standardized norm reference test to a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old or an infant, tools like the AEPS that can be embedded within the context of daily activities and routines are being considered for that use even more, and for accountability purposes. So those of you who are working with children who are receiving services through the Office of Special Education Programs have to report data for accountability purposes. And so the AEPS has been validated for that purpose as well. As I mentioned, it is an authentic assessment. One of the hallmarks of early childhood assessment is that it is an assessment that is conducted within the context in which children spend time, within activities within children spend time, using materials that the child needs in order to be effective and in order to use and engage with that activity, and also using the skills that that child needs to know in order to be able to be independent in that activity. And so that's how we define authentic assessment. And the AEPS meets the characteristics of authentic assessment in a variety of different ways. We often use authentic assessment. We think about natural environments, meaning that we're conducting it within the context in which children spend time, whether that's at home or that's a center-based program, or that's out in the community or wherever the child is spending time. The AEPS has associated with it assessment activities that can be used where items from the AEPS have been embedded into those activities to create a more authentic setting in which to gather information. I'm going to be sharing more information about assessment activities in a bit. In terms of the data collection methods, so authentic assessment data collection methods are typically twofold: observation and family input. And we're going to talk about how families can be involved and how we can observe children virtually to be able to get the information we need in order to score AEPS items. Also, the AEPS helps you generate functional and generalizable skills. And so for those of you who are new to the AEPS, you need to be reminded that the items on here may look different than items from other tests that you've used, where the child is asked to use contrived items that may or may not be part of their natural environment to perform a task associated with that, such as putting strings on a bead, putting together a block tower, putting together an inlaid puzzle. The items that are part of the AEPS are those items that the child needs in order to engage engage with those materials or other materials that are part of their natural environment. So the test items can be embedded into a variety of activities and routines that match with what the needs of the family and the child are. So getting started, doing virtual assessment within this context. In planning this presentation, I was working with a colleague who's also an author on the AEPS 3, and one of the things that we had a lot of discussion about is just this idea of thinking about the stress and what our providers, but also what families are dealing with right now within the context of COVID and how this is impacting families. And so I know all of us know of young parents who are perhaps unemployed, or young parents who are trying to work from home, who have children with challenging behavior, who have children who can't independently play by themselves, who have children, multiple children in their home, and they're trying to balance a lot of things right now. And so with assessment, a lot of times, because we have so many mandates for getting assessment done quickly and according to timelines, that we sometimes we forget the impact that, or may forget the impact that this context has, especially on young families who have children with disabilities. The second thing that we have to think about is, what is the purpose for which we are doing the assessment? And so that will have implications in terms of how much of the assessment that we have to do, because there are certain purposes for which we do the assessment that we may not have to do the entire test for. For others, we may have to assign scores to all of the test items. And so we need to know ahead of time what is the purpose for what we were doing. And we need to prioritize what you're gathering information about. And so this comes especially true when we're thinking about doing the AEPS for progress monitoring, for identifying goals, for program planning. For all of those purposes, we need to really prioritize the information that we are going to gather from the child and from the family. So let me talk about each of these purposes and talk a bit about some of the things that we need to think about. For program planning purposes in the AEPS, remember, first of all, let me, as I always try to do when I'm doing AEPS, is to really differentiate for you between the two components of how we gather information related to the AEPS. The first is the gathering piece. And I'm going to be talking about a lot about how we gather information. What are the different, when we would typically be on a home visit, sitting in a child's home, watching a child engage with their family, or we might be in a classroom and we might be watching children play with one another, or engaged in some kind of planned teacher-led activity. In those kind of situations, it's very easy to gather information. And so we're going to talk about different strategies for doing that virtually. But that's one component. The second component is putting in the scores. Whether it be on paper or it be in the AEPSI. And so those two are two separate acts that we have to think about and we have to consider when we are doing the AEPS. It's not just assigning scores and it's not just observing children, it's both of those things. And so given that those are two labor-intensive, time-intensive things that we are asking people to do, then we have to think very carefully about what the purpose is for which we're doing the assessment, so that we can know, if you will, how much of the assessment we have to do. So for program planning purposes, if what we're trying to do is to figure out what to teach the child right now in the situation in which that child is spending time, whether it's that you are a preschool teacher and right now you are being asked to deliver instruction to a whole group or to a small group of children through Google Classroom or through Zoom, or you are doing early intervention through coaching families through FaceTime or on some other modality. We need to really focus on the skills that are going to address the family's concerns during this particular time. And so when children haven't, for example, been around other groups of children, and they haven't spent time with other children. Families may be very concerned about the maintenance of skills or what skills the child might not lose because they're not in a preschool or they're in a child care situation. And so if the child has a language delay and that child was getting a lot of language stimulation by being around other children and, getting, a speech and language pathologist who was coming into their classroom and providing integrated service delivery, and that's not there anymore, then the family might be very concerned about whether or not that child is making progress and whether the child's going to maintain those skills or not. So you may want to focus on the social communication area in that case. I've talked with many families who have children with disabilities who have challenging behavior that's resulting from the lack of routine that they are experiencing from being at home, and families trying to juggle all of these multiple things that they have to deal with. And so challenging behavior may be something that they may be dealing with right now. And so you may want to focus on the social emotional area of the AEPS. Or maybe right now, families are really wanting their children to be more independent and be able to do some things for themselves when they're trying to work instead of interrupting their work all the time. And so maybe the adaptive area is where you might want to focus. And so considering what is going on with the family is a good place to start when you are trying to deliver instruction virtually to the child, to the family, and then focus your the data collection in that area that is of concern to the family. When it comes to progress monitoring and AEPS, we are going to rely on the family's input regarding whether or not the child is making progress or not. And this is not necessarily sending families data sheets and telling them to do a language sample, but this is, getting the family's input, which is something we've always advocated with regard to the AEPS, and using those conversations that we have with families to make judgments about whether or not the child is making progress or not. And we're going to talk a bit more about the family report in a second. But a lot of what you're going to be doing now more than ever is having conversations with families about what they have concerns about, how things are going with their child. And so, listening to that information and then being able to interpret that in such a way that you can make a judgment about how to score the AEPS item is something that is something we may have not had to do as much before, but it's something that we're going to have to learn how to do better. You also may want to target your data collection on certain skills. And so certainly for those of you who are working with children with IEPs or IFSPs, then you all are really focused in, first of all, a specific developmental area, but you may also be really focused in a certain goal area, whether it's, that the child is learning to say single words, or the child is learning to, socially interact with their brothers and sisters while they're at home. And so looking at the strands within the AEPS that are connected with the goals that are part of the child's IEP or IFSP is a good way to really focus your data collection instead of trying to do the entire thing, which can become overwhelming for some folks. Also, you think about using a variety of data collection methods that can be easily shared, and I'm going to talk about an app that can help you with this in a bit, but everybody has a phone, it seems like, and so doing little recordings or doing videos that demonstrate, that are targeted toward those goals that you're trying to collect data on can be very helpful to you as well. When it comes to the AEPS and eligibility, I just want to remind you, for those of you who are less familiar with this, that the AEPS has been validated for eligibility purposes to either corroborate or also to stand as a standalone eligibility tool. And it's done by using the cutoff scores. And so there were analyses that were done where we looked at a group of children who are typically developing, and then we looked at which of the skills in each of the developmental areas children of certain ages were able to master. And so we did an analysis of the goals within each of those scores, and we have a cut score at 3-month intervals for level 2. I'm sorry, 3-month intervals for level 1 and 6-month intervals for level 2, which is the 3 to 6. And then with eligibility, what is going to have to happen is that you're going to have to, in order to be able to attain a cut score, you're going to have to be able to do at minimum every item or every goal with the corresponding objectives within an area in which you have concerns. And so if your primary area of concern is in the social communication area, you would do that area. You would then compare that child's total goal score to the cut score for that child's age, and you would be able to ascertain whether that child is at or below the cut score, which would therefore demonstrate that the child has a suspected developmental delay. If the child's cut score is above, then the child would be deemed to be developmentally on target. There's information about the cut scores that we can make available to you all. We have white papers about how those are determined. Also within the AEPSI, there is a report that you can run on all areas of the AEPS to determine whether or not a child is at or below the cut score in certain areas. By using the AEPS for eligibility, you bypass the constraints of the normative assessment. And so I have a really good friend who's a school psychologist, and she in the spring was trying to do tests like the WISC and the Battelle and other types of norm referenced assessments on a screen with the child. And those of us who have worked around young children for a long time can imagine what the frustration was for both the child, the parent, and the psychologist who may be trying to do this. Given that the AEPS allows you to collect information, observation, or through conversations with families, then it allows us to get good information about eligibility without going through the constraints of those normative assessments. The strength of the data that you get through the AEPS is the fact that you are getting those data through multiple informants and through various observation contexts. And when you look at recommended practices for how to do eligibility assessment, it always says that you need to have multiple sources of information. And so the AEPS is set up so that it allows you to use multiple sources of data in order to make eligibility decisions. Also, because the eligibility assessment is oftentimes linked to the development of the child's IFSP or IEP, by doing the AEPS for eligibility purposes, it allows you to be able to develop functional goals that are going to be priorities for the family. Excuse me, I'm going to take a triple sip of water. So I want to talk about some steps for virtual data collection, and then we will talk about some of the strategies that you can use for doing it. And Amy, you may want to give me a little hint. I have no idea what time it is, so I hope I'm doing okay on time.
Yeah, you're doing great. We're about at 2:30, so another maybe like 20 minutes, and then we'll take questions.
Super. Okay. So kind of identified some steps here for virtual data collection. First of all, you need to make sure that the family understands the purpose of the data collection. And so we talk about this whether it's virtual or not, but in this situation, I think that families need to understand that you're doing this so that you can support their child in getting services, or you're doing this so that you can see that the child is making progress or not, or you're doing this so that you can help develop the next goals for the child. And so determining or letting families know what the purpose of data collection is really important. The second is trying to figure out how the families want to be involved in the interview. And so I use the word interview which can be structured or it can be unstructured. If we're doing this for purposes of identifying goals, then I would suggest that you do the family report, which I'll talk about in a bit. And the family report is more of a structured type of process where we're talking to families about routines and activities that are particularly causing them or troubling to them right now, and what they would like to see be some of the goals for their children. But unstructured interview can also be used to help you score some of the items on the AEPS. And I mentioned one of these earlier when I talked about progress monitoring. And so having a conversation with a family about, you know, how are meal times going for you now? You know, using those good open-ended questioning strategies that we know are so important, and listening to the family talk about, you know, what foods the child is eating, how independent the child is when they're eating, you know, how, if they're interacting with other people at meal times, if they're able to use their cup when they're having a meal. And so, you know, asking questions, broad questions, can be very helpful and give you a lot of information about whether or not the child is making progress, especially toward those routines and those goals that are particularly particular priorities for families. The third thing that I think is so important is discussing with the family their capacity to use technology and which type that they're actually able to use. And those are definitely two different things. I know that we've all seen scenes. I just saw on the television last night a child that was sitting outside of a fast food restaurant trying to connect to the internet. And so definitely families are struggling in many parts of our state, in our country, to try to have access to the internet. And so if we have technologies that are completely reliant on or solely reliant on internet usage, for some families that's not going to be an issue. When we look at these symbols that are across the bottom, we all know families that have access to all of these, but we also know families who have access to none or few of them. Many families, regardless, it seems, of socioeconomic background, though, do oftentimes have a cell phone, have an access to a cell phone. And so that may be the only way that they can do that. But remember, in some communities, their access to cell phone may be dependent on a card that they're getting where they're downloading minutes so that they can communicate with other family members. And so we're going to have to be very respectful about how families are able to use and what their capacity is for technology. And then also, you know, whether or not they understand how to use it. And that's probably more a problem for people that are my age than many of the families that you work with. But certainly it's something that we want to ensure and support them in doing, is to be able to use the technology to support their child's development and their intervention. And then step 4 is to try to agree on strategies for collecting the data. So we have to think about really 2 things here. The first is when we're going to do that. So we want activities that reflect the child's strengths and their needs. And so asking families to engage in and support their children to engage with materials or in activities that show where the strengths are for the child, but also where their needs are, or where there are skills that are emerging, is something that we can think about and do. Also, are there activities that offer opportunity for interactions with other people in the child's family? There are places I know where I've gotten many emails from parents who say, we're starting a pod and our neighbors are our best friends, and we've all between us got, you know, 6 4-year-olds or 6 3-year-olds, and we're going to bring them all together, and we want to know if you have a student that can come and teach them. And so, you know, there may be those kind of opportunities that are out there that some of you all are dealing with. But if not, there may be siblings or other people in the child's life that you can create opportunities to determine and watch those interactions beyond just the interactions between the child and the parent. And then trying to find activities that are of interest to the child. I found the greatest joy in the spring watching our teachers engage in story time Zoom sessions where they would bring a book, you know, and share it online, or one of the other parents would do that. And one of the things that the children enjoyed more than anything was the materials that the teachers delivered to their homes so that they could engage with materials while this story time was going on. And so trying to find something that is of interest to the child that you can use as your context, if you will, for gathering information is certainly something that's very important. So let me talk then about the hows. So one thing that we suggest is that we talked about that one of the reasons why we collect assessment information is to determine the goals that the family is interested in us working on. And many of you all said that was the primary reason you would be doing the AEPS. And so just as a reminder, the AEPS family report has two parts to it, or two sections to it. The first part is what we call, the first section is the routine section. And there's a screenshot of the AEPS family report here. And it has a list of daily activities and routines. These would be activities that could occur at home. However, many of them would also occur in a center-based program. And for each of those different routines, it asks a series of 4 questions, just to give some information about the routine, a little bit more detailed information related to the routine, and then for all of the routines, why this routine is working, basically, and why it's not working. For those of you who work in early intervention that are familiar with the routines-based interview, it's very much in keeping with that philosophy of trying to support the family in identifying and starting out thinking about, you know, what are the contexts in which you have your greatest concerns. And so section 1 is talking about the routines. Section 2 of the AEPS family report is where we've taken all of the goals from both level 1 and level 2, and they have been rewritten in terminology that will be understandable to the family. And then we ask families questions to get their perceptions about how their child is doing. And so this form, the AEPS family report, could be used for a variety of different assessment purposes. If we're trying to figure out, for program planning purposes, what goals we want to focus on, then information from the family report can help us do that. It also could help us if we're trying to find out whether or not a child is making progress or not. And so you'll notice on here that there's actually like a score sheet. And so we don't ask the families to assign scores like we do on the CODRF, but instead we ask them to say, yes, my child does this all the time, or my child does this some of the time, or my child never does this. And so just not that we're asking them to continually complete the entire AEPS form, family report form, but if there is an area that is of concern to the family and we want to get some periodic data collection of how the child is making progress, then we can use the family report for that purpose. The AEPS family report is available for download on the AEPSI, but Amy's going to tell you at the end about how you can now get a fillable PDF family report form that you can use with the families. You could send it to them through email, or you could go over the family report with them over the phone. And again, as with all of this, how much of this you do with the family really depends on what your assessment question is. You know, if you're really trying to find out, learning about a new family, and you're really trying to find out, you know, what their concerns are, and, you know, and what the goals may want to be, you might want to do both sections of this. But if you're just really trying to get some information about the child's progress and area of fine motor, then you may just want to ask the family to complete this one part of the family report. So it all has to align with what it is that you're interested in. So the family report, as I mentioned just a second ago, is available for release, download for free through December 31st of 2020. And Brooks is doing this specifically so that folks that are out there that are struggling with virtual data collection will have access to this during that time. The next thing that you could do is that you could ask families to send you a short video of the child completing one of the assessment activities. So I mentioned before that one of the hallmarks of the AEPS is that it allows you to embeds functional goals within the context of activities and routines. And so when we developed the AEPSI, we developed 3 sets of assessment activities that are only part of the AEPSI. And the AEPSI, what we did is that we took every item from level 1 and we embedded them into home routines that are part of a child's and a family's home routine, or their schedule, if you will. We also made another set of activities that are part of center-based routines, so things that would go on at school. And so one of the things that you could do is that you could send the family a copy of one of the assessment activities, and then ask the family to videotape the child engage with that activity. Now, in the slide here, we see, you know, some very fancy little toys and that sort of thing. But most of the routines do not require, you know, store-bought toys in order to do them. It's very, very simple materials that most families are going to have on hand. That they could engage their child with in order to send us a video, or if you're in a Zoom, if you happen to be have Zoom or Google Classroom or some kind of, or FaceTime, where you could actually watch the child do that, then you can use that as the context of one of your observations, so that you can watch the child interact with the materials that are embedded into the activities that will help you score some of the AEPS items. And so this is an example of one of the assessment activities that you're going to actually get today. This is story time. And this is an activity that could occur whether it's a parent or a caregiver that's doing a story with a child, or if you are in a virtual format and you're able to read a story to a child. Many of our teachers here in the spring, when they weren't able to see the children, they would actually read stories to individual children. And the children were so happy to see their teachers, they actually also listened. And so you use this then as a score sheet to help you identify where the child is, which skills within that activity the child has mastered, which ones are emerging, or which ones the child is not ready for yet. And just like the regular score sheet that you'll see in the regular AEPSI, it gives you in the regular AEPS CODRF, it gives you an opportunity for checking whether this should be an IEP goal or an IFSP outcome. It also gives you the opportunity to list what type of scoring note that you used, and also if you have any comments about that. On the assessment activities planning forms, it tells you, you know, exactly what this activity is about. It also gives you some ideas of different types of materials that you can use to implement the activity. Basically, whenever I do this activity with the child, I just sit down with them with a book and read to them. And so all of you all are early childhood educators and are familiar with the types of book that are going to allow you to, see whether or not a child can fill in a nursery rhyme or not, or is to see whether or not the child can imitate words, etc. And so by participating in this webinar today, you all are going to get 3 assessment activities. You're going to get 2, I believe, from Storybook, and also you're going to get level 1 and level 2 for story time, and then you're also going to get meal time for level 1 for those of you who are working with really young infants, where you're looking at more very, very simple routines. So that's exactly what I just said. So I'm sure that Amy's going to talk to you all about how you can get all of the materials that I'm mentioning today. But these assessment activities are brief activities that allow you to collect a lot of information. And for those of you who have been doing the AEPS for a long period of time, you know that the more you know the AEPS, the more that you know the items, the easier it is for you to spot those items when the child is engaged in any kind of assessment, any kind of routine or activity. And so the assessment activities can really help you focus and target that observation so that you can get a lot of information. Also, this is something that's brand new. For those of you who are not AEPSI users, Brooks is also going to do a special release of the fillable files for all of the AEPSI assessment activities. So there are, for routines, I believe there are 7 separate AEPS assessment activities. So that means that if you decide you can administer the assessment by observing the child or having the family engage the child with, or if you ever get to be face-to-face, you engage the child with a set of activities, and by completing those activities with the child, you are then able to assess every item on the AEPS. So the same is true for level 1 and for level 2. For level 2, there's a set of 8, or for center base, there's a set of 8 activities that you can do. So between now or end of late September and into next year, you all will be able to get these. And Amy will tell you more about that at the end as we go on. Another data collection idea that that our teachers were able to use this past spring, and I did some research prior to this webinar to see if there was anything comparable. Perhaps some of you all out there know of things that are comparable. But this is a classroom management system, for lack of a better word, that starts for preschool. It's called Seesaw, and you see the website here. And it's really designed as a way for families and for classroom teachers to communicate with one another. But what is different about it than other types of apps that are out there is that it allows families to upload information into it, whether it's whether it's something that, whether it's a video or whether it's a picture of a child doing something, or a picture of a work sample of, something that a child's done. And so our teachers found it to be very useful. And one of the creative things that one of our teachers did is that she created activities and embedded the child's current goals. So, at our school, we have children with and without disabilities. Every child has their own goal. And so she embedded the child's current goals into an activity, asked the family to engage the child with that activity, and then upload it so that she could then score the child's progress on goals that the child was working on. So she used it more as a progress monitoring to see whether or not the child was able to make progress on those items on which they had previously scored a 0 or a 1. The core Seesaw service is free, but there are paid versions, just like there are with all apps. But as far as I know, our teachers just use the free service because we don't have any money. The other thing that you could do, social communication area is also one. I don't know, the statistics are very high for the number of children that are receiving early intervention and preschool services through OSEP or through our Part B and Part C because of social communication, because of language and speech delays. And so the AEPS social communication areas, as we all know, for those of us who've been doing it for a while, is one of the more challenging areas to try to score. And so asking families to record a quick conversation and then send that to you is one way that you could perhaps score some of those items in the social communication area. Several of times our teachers also, when they were doing lessons, meaning that they were twice a week, they did some kind of a large group activity with the children on Zoom when we were doing virtual. And so they recorded those sessions, and then they were able to go back and observe and watch those sessions and then score items in different areas of the AEPS. And so that's another way that you could get some of that social communication. So I think this is kind of what I said here. So using video conferencing, whether it's Zoom or FaceTime or Google Classroom, you could do individual activities with children, like I said, reading a story to a child or doing something with a child or with groups of children. And then if you can record those, then you'll be able to go back then and score the items that you observe. I think, and I say this all the time when I talk about observation as it relates to the AEPS, that being intentional is very important. And so the more that you know, which items that are the items that the child is struggling with, or the more that you know which area of the AEPS that the child is having the greatest difficulty with, or knowing which items that the child scored a 0 or 1 on, and being intentional about how you plan activities so that it creates opportunities for you to observe children in those activities is going to benefit you greatly as you go back and then try to score those items. But any of those platforms will allow you to do some of that. So just as a reminder, the AEPSI also has reports that you can share information with families. And so you could do this through shared screen on your computer. All of these sheets, of course, are available in paper versions as well, but currently there are no fillable downloads that are available through Brooks. But I think most of us are learning how to master the shared screen, and so having conversations with families about their child's progress using these visual platforms that we have available to us is something that can also be very useful because families want to know whether their children are making progress or not. So there are some challenges to virtual data collection. There are privacy issues, making sure that we are HIPAA compliant. I have a friend that is a speech and language pathologist, and she's doing preschool speech and language pathology over Google Classroom right now. And the challenge of trying to figure out, how we keep each individual child's data separate, and even families knowing that other children are part of this and who has an IP, all of those privacy issues are going to be very challenging. And so we have to be really careful about how we do that. For those of you who maybe use SharePoint or one of the Google Drives, my understanding is that those are platforms that are HIPAA compliant. They've made us all migrate toward those for putting all of our records for our university students on there. So storing videos in a safe place like that is considered HIPAA compliant would be a recommendation. Access to computer equipment is also going to be a challenge for some of your families, and more specifically also just access to the internet. And so I think that for those of you who are working in school districts, I think that school districts are trying very hard to equip families, even families of preschoolers, with some type of technology so that they can engage with their teachers, and hopefully also increasing access to hotspots and other type of internet access. And confidentiality and computer security, I think that I've already tried to address that just a little bit, but those are going to be challenges as we move forward. And none of us know how long this is going to last, and so we just have to be cognizant of that, and I'm sure we're going to learn along the way. I know that the Office of Special Education Programs, they periodically will have webinars for providers. I happen to hear about them because I have grants that are funded through the federal government, but they frequently will have information on their website about some of these issues regarding virtual data collection and that sort of thing. And so that could be a resource that you might want to look into. So in conclusion, recognize that this is a special context and it is difficult for everyone. It's difficult for our children. You know, we are, as a profession, one that typically espouses that children should not be spending a lot of time in front of a screen, and yet we are having to be forced to be using it as a tool for gathering some information for regulatory or for other purposes. And so it is difficult for children. It's difficult for us. There definitely is a level of fatigue sitting in front of a screen, not just sitting in front of a screen, but sitting in front of Zoom or something comparable to it that is already being researched, I know. And the same is true for families who oftentimes may be working full time from a screen and then have to interact with one of us. And so we just have to recognize that it is a special context. So be patient with your parents and be patient with yourself. I find myself getting very frustrated at myself when I don't know how to do something new that's been thrown at me for the first time. And so be patient with parents as they try to figure that out. And make sure that you are grateful to families for sharing their time with you. And also, I can't say enough about, actually about active listening to what families have to say, and we oftentimes, because we are under such tight timelines, we are often in such a hurry to try to get through conversations and get through sessions and get through an assessment. And so we want to be patient with families, and we want to thank them for their time and recognize the challenge that they are experiencing. And also we want to learn from this experience, because we don't know when we're going to have to do it again. I think many of us believed that this would all be fixed by fall, and it's not, and it may not be fixed in January. And that's not a political statement. It's just that none of us really know. And so let's just try to keep doing better and sharing with each other and leaning upon each other, and we'll get it done. And we want to thank Brooks for offering these opportunities for you all, and also trying to give you all some tools that you can use to make the experience just a little bit better. So I'm going to turn it now back to Amy, and I'll field some questions if you'd like for me to, and then she'll share some information with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. So everybody, we'll take questions in just a few minutes. There's already a couple good ones in the chat box that I have, but if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in. I just want to give you a few slides of information. So this is the first webinar in our series, and so we'll be doing those every Thursday for the next 4 weeks. There'll be 5 total. So the next one is on engaging families. So if you'll follow that link on your website, on your screen, and it's also in the chat box to register for the other webinars, we would love to have you join us. On the next slide, Brooks is also hosting some short coffee chats on different early childhood topics. We have one on September 23rd on autism interventions for young kids, and another one on dual language learners on October 7th. So please, I encourage you to check those out as well. And then I wanted to also share that we compiled a bunch of COVID-19 resources from lots of organizations, like the ECTA Center has some great resources on teleintervention. 0 to 3 has really good resources on young children. So we compiled all of those resources at the URL that's on your screen now. So I encourage you to check that out too if you have questions during this challenging time. And those URLs are all in your chat box. And just one more reminder, we really would love to have your feedback for the survey. And the next slide is the certificate of attendance. So if you are listening listening to the recording, jot down, you can pause your recording right now, jot down that URL and get your certificate. For those of you listening live, it's in your handout section. It'll be emailed to you tomorrow. And then you also, of course, can jot down that link right now as well, if you'd rather do that. So we want to make sure that everyone gets their certificate because we know how important that is. And all right, so now we're going to start taking some questions. So let's see. So our first question, we have a listener who was asking about, so if a parent fills out the family report in part 2, they're asking about how they should score those goals. So should they make the assumption that the child's meeting the criteria in the manual, even though the family may not have the exact criteria?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And so what we typically say to people when we're doing training is that, the CODRF or the test itself is it's a validated, tool. It's a valid, reliable tool. The family report is not actually a test in and of itself. And the intent of it during normal times is to be used to help supplement as we try to, figure out, a child's score. So for example, sometimes families will say that a child can do this all the time at home. But when we've observed the child, we've not ever seen the child do it, and so in those kind of situations, we talk about the fact that if we're seeing inconsistent performance, then we would score, we would have a score of 1. In situations like this, I wouldn't say that it's a replacement for the test, but I think that in some cases we may have to rely more heavily on it for helping us score the AEPS items than we've done in the past. And so I'm not saying that it's a complete replacement, but I think that we would. So as I talked about, what the items, the family would say that the child they do it all the time. That would correspond with a score of a 2. If they're doing it some of the time, a score of a 1. And if they're never doing it, a score of a 0. And so we can use that, in lieu of areas where we can get information from nowhere else. I tend to think that, if it really, again, it goes back to the purpose for which you are doing the assessment. And so if you're using the family report to help support progress monitoring, that's one thing, because the parent's perception, the parent who is with the child all the time, their perception is probably going to be way more reliable than yours is because you've not been seeing that child. On the other hand, if I'm doing the AEPS for eligibility purposes, I would be reluctant to rely completely on the family report to score all of the items on the test. So I hope you see that distinction, not discrimination, it's distinction.
Sorry, I just realized I was muted. So another question. So if you're using a virtual platform to assess a student, is there anything that needs to be included in like the write-up or the report about the validity or reliability that the assessment was done virtually?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Certainly would be something that I would probably make comment on, which you can do in the AEPSI or on your score sheet. Also, if you're relying heavily, especially for progress monitoring, again, on report from family to score an item, you need to remember that in your scoring notes, one of the scoring notes is R for report, which means basically that you got that information from somewhere else besides observing the item yourself. And so that would be a really good way if you are having to rely heavily on family for scoring items to show or to demonstrate that you got the information that way.
Great, thank you. We're getting some questions in the chat box. Just so this session is being recorded. You'll receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow afternoon. You'll also receive a link to your certificate in that email. There's also a blank one in your handout panel. Oh, I just got a question about the survey link. There isn't actually a link for the survey. When we end our session, the survey is going to pop up automatically for you to take, and then it's embedded in the email tomorrow as well. So you can also take the survey tomorrow. But it's not really open at a link. We have a question. So how would you recommend engaging families that don't have access to the internet and they also don't have access to a phone? This program, this listener, they've been mailing out information and activities, but they obviously have limited contact back from the family. So do you have any recommendations for what they could do?
Well, I mean, I think I think they are very limited. Your options are very limited. I mean, our teachers, they frequently did home visits, where they would just drop stuff off and they would practice social distancing out in the yard and, hand things to parents. And, and so, that, depending on your level of comfort, that's about the only other way that I know that you can get information from families. I don't know of any other way.
Right, sure. Well, thank you very much for everyone. That's all of our questions that we've had submitted. So we really appreciate everyone joining us, and we hope that you can join us for the remaining webinars in this series. And one more time, just as a reminder, the recording and the certificate and all of the link to the downloadable fillable AEPS family report and those sample assessment activities, that will all be in your follow-up email, which will come out tomorrow afternoon. So thank you so much, Jen, for this presentation. It was really helpful. And thank you to everyone for listening. We hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Okay.